Welcome to the Miami Book Fair. This is our 32nd anniversary, and we're being hosted by Miami-Dade College. I'm Julie Alexander, and I'm your room host. Thank you for your patience. We're running a little late, but without further ado, I would like to welcome Charles and Clydette DeGroat.
Thank you. I'm Charles DeGroat. This is Clydette. We're co-directors of the DeGroat Foundation. And tonight, Ted Koppel will be in conversation with Tom Houston. Tom is Vice President of News and Special Correspondent for WLRN. He hosts and produces the Sunshine Economy and anchors the Florida Roundup, in addition to leading the organization's news engagement strategy. Tom is most recently the co-anchor and managing editor of Nightly Business Report on public television. Prior to co-anchoring NBR, he was host and managing editor of the nationally syndicated financial television program First Business. Tom also reported and anchored market coverage for the groundbreaking web-based financial news service WebFN, which beginning in 2001 was among the first live online streaming video outlets. He also writes a weekly column for the Miami Herald and the McClatchy Tribune news service. While Tom was co-anchoring and managing NBR, the program was awarded the 2012 Program Excellence Award by American Public Television. Tom also has been awarded 2 National Press Foundation fellowships, including one for the Wharton Seminars for Business Journalism in 2006.
Ted Koppel, a 42-year veteran of ABC News, was anchor and managing editor of Nightline from 1980 to 2005. He has won every significant television award, including 8 Peabody Awards, 11 Overseas Press Club Awards, 12 DuPont Columbia Awards, and 42 Emmys. He has been a contributing columnist to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, Off Camera. In his latest book, the one he'll speak about tonight, Lights Out, a Cyber Attack, A Nation Unprepared, Surviving the Aftermath, Koppel reveals that a major cyber attack on America's power grid is not only possible, but likely, that it would be devastating, and that the United States is shockingly unprepared. With urgency and authority, one of our most renowned journalists examines a threat unique to our time and evaluates potential ways to prepare for a catastrophe that is all but inevitable. The former director of the NSA, retired General Keith Alexander, says of Lights Out, "It is a wake-up call for all of us." Please welcome Tom Hudson and Ted Koppel.
That's very kind of you. Is this thing on? You'd better stand up now because you won't stand up when I'm through.
Ted, in the introduction, welcome to Miami, by the way.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to see such a packed house on a Saturday night in Miami for the book fair. Wonderful. All right.
May I, before you ask your first question, John Meacham was such a charming and engaging speaker.
Yeah.
And even consistently amusing that I just want to tell you a quick story because there won't be a whole lot of giggles after this. In 1972, I was in China with Richard Nixon, and I found myself one morning sitting in a minibus next to James Michener. And Michener told me this story, which he swore was true. It's an author's story, so it's appropriate here. He said that he got a call one evening right around dinner time from someone who said, Mr. Michener, congratulations. He said, our organization has voted you the greatest living American author, and we would like you to come and accept the award. And he named a time and place. Michener said, that's lovely. Thank you very much. That's a terrific award. Do you mind if I consult my calendar? And he went and got his calendar, and he said, you know, I'm terribly sorry, but I have a previous engagement which I'm afraid I can't change. And it was a long pause. And then the caller said, well, can you think of another greatest living American author? And Michener said, well, sure. He said, what about Vonnegut or Mailer? And the guy said, no, we already tried them. They couldn't make it either. Okay. As I say, the giggles end here.
When they asked me to interview Koppel, that's what I figured was going to happen. Koppel was going to interview the audience here. So, in the introduction, Ted, they described this book using your words, the publisher's words, the promotional words, as a wake-up call for the United States, for regulators, for the electricity industry. Has the industry, have regulators, have Americans woken up?
Well, if they have, I'm not sure I see any evidence of it yet, but it's early. I mean, the book's only been out 3 weeks. Let me put this into context for you. We are currently sitting here in the aftermath of a Russian jet being blown out of the sky, in the aftermath of the terrible attack in Paris, in the aftermath of what just happened in West Africa. And our political leaders, and I use the term very loosely, at least those who would like to be our political leaders, are covering themselves with a lack of glory. All the talk now is about the need to protect the nation against the influx of 10,000 Syrian Muslim refugees. And I would argue that we have long since passed the day when what we need to be most worried about is some terrorist blowing himself or herself up with a suicide vest, even in a crowded venue. We're beyond that, folks. We are living in an age now in which cyber terrorists have the capacity to take down all or part of one of our electric power grids. You don't have to use a great deal of imagination to know what would happen. Down here in Miami, you are familiar with the impact of a hurricane, when perhaps the electricity may go out for a matter of hours or even a matter of days. What I'm talking about here is a cyber attack on a power grid in which all or part of the grid comes down, and the impact would be that tens of millions of Americans would be without power for a matter of weeks or even months. Think about that for a moment and then tell me how worried you are about those refugees coming in.
In fact, you write in the book, we have become disoriented by the similarities between the aftermath of a natural disaster, such as a hurricane, and what will be required when it comes to helping the nation deal with the aftermath of a cyber attack on a grid. What are those differences?
Well, the main difference is one of scope and duration. An earthquake in California, for example, might have a similar kind of scope where you could have millions of people forced out of their homes, thousands of people immediately dying, but even there you'd be talking about a relatively limited region. And the aftermath of that would be devastating, but are we capable of handling 1 million domestic refugees in this country? We probably are. But what if the number, imagine for a moment just if New York City were deprived of power for a period of weeks or months. We aren't accustomed in our urban centers to having a storehouse of food. I mean, most apartment dwellers will have maybe enough food for another day or two. If you pick up the phone and you call the Red Cross, if you pick up the phone and you call FEMA, or pick up the phone and call the Department of Homeland Security, or go online to one of those sites, what you will find is that they recommend that you do what you would do in the wake of or in anticipation of a hurricane. Have a 2 to 3 day supply of food and water. Make sure you have a battery-powered radio and that you have fresh batteries for it. Have a little bit of extra money. Make sure that you and your family know, if you're separated, where it is you're going to go in order to meet. That's it. That doesn't cut it in the event of a cyber attack on the power grid. The power grid is a terribly sensitive mechanism. Let me give you just a very simple example. It's an oversimplified example. We have to have exactly the same amount of power being generated, electricity being generated throughout the grid, as is being used by the country as a whole. Imagine a balloon with 1,000 valves. 500 of those valves are letting air into the balloon. 500 of those valves are letting air out of the balloon. As long as the amount coming in and the amount going out are exactly the same, the balloon remains perfectly inflated. Too much air in, the balloon explodes. Too much air out, the balloon collapses. We have to maintain a perfect balance in our power system, our power grids, between the amount of energy that is produced and the amount of energy that is used. We have, in the United States today, 3,200 power companies. They're all linked. If for some reason the balance between the power coming in and the power going out is not maintained, the system begins to collapse. That can only be maintained when you have that many operations functioning, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of operations that are required to function simultaneously. It can only be handled by the internet. So if someone can get into the mechanism within the internet, the so-called SCADA systems, the SCADA systems are supervisory control and data acquisition systems. Get into those, knock it out of balance, and you have cascading outages that will be far beyond anything we've ever known from a natural disaster.
As you've gone through the reporting process, you spoke with industry advocates, you spoke with electricity generating and distribution executives, you spoke with federal and state regulators, you spoke with military experts, emergency management experts, legislators. Gauge their level of engagement and their ability to grasp the scenario that you have laid out there.
Well, let's start with the power industry itself. It's almost insulting to suggest that they don't grasp the danger. Of course they do. They are fully aware of what the danger is. And the larger power companies, what is it, Florida Light?
FPL.
FPL,
Yes.
Florida Power and Light. Florida Power and Light is a gigantic organization. I am confident that they have spent not just tens of millions, but probably hundreds of millions of dollars in their cyber defenses. The smaller companies, however, and there are hundreds upon hundreds of them, are investor-owned. They're more worried about profit than they are about security. And the problem with a network of 3,200 companies is if you get into the weakest part of the network, you can affect the strongest part of the network.
Speak to the level of engagement that you encountered in regards to regulators.
Well, and again, this gets awfully wonky. The notion of regulation, the power industry a number of years ago was deregulated. That works out very well from an economic point of view because it means there is simply more competition between and among power companies in this country. From the point of view of imposing federal regulations, security regulations, regulations that might toughen the industry up against cyber attack, here is the problem. The body, it's called NERC. It's the North American Electric Regulatory Commission or something. NERC is the body that represents the power industry. FERC, F-E-R-C, is the federal body that theoretically, it doesn't just theoretically, it proposes the legislation to the industry. Mark my words there, proposes. The industry then has to vote on that proposal. And unless 60% of the industry approves of the proposal that the federal government wants to impose upon them, it doesn't get passed. Now, if you have an industry that decides what regulations it is going to tolerate, you're not going to get the toughest regulations.
In the book, you describe not just an existential threat, a real threat. Who's behind it? Who's posing the threat?
Well, first of all, let me just make the point that this is not Ted saying this is going to happen. The reason I began to write the book in the first place, the reason I started looking into it is the president, I wonder how many people took note of it at the time. The president, in 2 successive State of the Union addresses, warned about the danger of cyber attackers going after our infrastructure, and he specifically singled out the electric power industry. The Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, at the time, spoke of a cyber Pearl Harbor. That was the sort of dimensions of the disaster he foresaw coming. Janet Napolitano, just before she left office, after 5 years as Secretary of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano spoke about the danger of a cyber attack. She's now the president of the University of California. I called her in researching the book, and I said, tell me, how seriously do you take the danger of a cyber attack on the power grid? And she said, very, very likely, 80 to 90%. So the likelihood of this happening is huge. You raised the question of who can do it. I've spoken to now the director, the former director of the NSA, the National Security Agency, Keith Alexander, and he referred me to his former chief scientist, a man by the name of George Cotter. Cotter tells me that he knows for a fact that the Chinese and the Russians are already inside our grid. They're there, literally with a keystroke. They could take down all or part of the grid. The Iranians are probably there. We don't know for sure. Here's the danger, or here's the good news and the bad news. The good news is that those who have the greatest capacity, the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, are actually the least likely to take the grid down because we have so many crisscrossing interests with the Chinese and even with the Russians and to a growing degree with the Iranians. Once you get to the level of the North Koreans, however, all of a sudden our common interests are few and far between. And then when you come down one more rung to groups like ISIS, that's where the danger is really chilling. Because what ISIS wants to do is to inflict pain and hardship on Western Europe, on the United States. And to be able to do that by remote control, when I'm told that there are plenty of experts out there that they can hire, they have a couple of $1 billion in hard cash available to them. You can get a lot of expertise with that. And then the equipment that you need, off the shelf, it's available. So this is a very real danger that is being confronted by the country right now. And where the federal government is just letting us down completely is there is no plan. And if there were a plan, you would think they would be eager to share it with all of us, all of you. But they haven't.
You describe the United States as confronting this. I would say we're facing it, but as you've laid out, there's not much confrontation happening in a real way.
Well, I mean, there are people, Craig Fugate, for example, who is the administrator of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
He had been the director of emergency management in Florida here.
And he is terrific. He only cares, I mean, what Janet Napolitano told me, she said, Craig only cares about two things. He cares about disaster response and University of Florida football. Those are the only two things he cares about. But he is amazing. I mean, we are very lucky to have him in that job. But he is not a guy, you know, he doesn't make the rules. He reports to the Department of Homeland Security, which I must tell you is one of the least efficient organizations in the federal government. And that's saying something. You know, they do an annual poll among federal workers in which they assess what employee satisfaction is, level of perceived leadership, and there are 19 separate federal agencies that are measured in this fashion. Department of Homeland Security comes in 19th in every category but one, and in that category it comes in 18th.
Not very reassuring at all. Let me ask you about the response. You mentioned you became curious about this after President Obama mentioned it 2 consecutive States of the Union addresses. We have seen some legislation proposed.
And passed.
And passed. Is it too late? Not enough? A start?
It's not too late, but it is not enough. That is for sure. The legislation. Look, part of this is, and you're a perfect example. Each of you individually and as a whole, we are all struggling internally with this battle between security on the one hand and privacy on the other. We care about privacy, we care about security. In the wake of 9/11, you know, all the emphasis was on security. Over the course of the past 14 years, gradually the pendulum has shifted back so that now I suspect it's fair to say that more Americans cared about privacy until last Friday, until Paris. Now, once again, I mean, and you can see it, the director of the FBI, Jim Comey, the Attorney General, people are talking about the need for some of these communications companies like Google, you know, and the telephone companies to remove. As you probably know, they now are capable of being locked so that only the owner of the phone, himself or herself, is capable of getting into it. He or she is the only person with the password. Even the phone company can't get in. And our law enforcement agencies are saying this is terribly dangerous because, for example, in France and in Belgium, over the last couple of weeks, there were communications which might normally have been intercepted, which can no longer be intercepted. So here we are with that struggle. Here we are in an election year in which I guarantee you this is going to become one of the issues that you're going to be asked to vote on. The people out there who will put the emphasis on privacy, the people out there who will put the emphasis on security. It's a tough call.
And how is that articulated in the legislation? We've seen proposed and potential solutions as you've gone through the reporting process that the experts are advocating.
Well, for example, the Senate passed some cyber legislation just a few weeks ago. The essence of it is the electric power companies were worried about the privacy of their subscribers, about the privacy of people whom they served. And therefore, there has been a reluctance among the power companies to share information with the federal government, with groups like the FBI and the NSA. The legislation that was finally passed after years by the US Senate tries to compromise on this issue. And the compromise they found is that before this information will be given to any federal government agency, it can be scrubbed by the power companies, scrubbed so that all privacy considerations are taken out of it. Then after it's been scrubbed, it is given to not the NSA, which is the most competent intelligence organization when it comes to cyber warfare, but to the Department of Homeland Security, which is the least competent. They then have the chance to scrub it for privacy considerations, and only then will it be handed over to the NSA. Now, I'm sure you understand that in a world in which microseconds are the amount of time in which information is communicated or in which an attack can take place, that taking the time to scrub this information before it finally gets to the NSA is destructive, self-destructive.
In examining the solutions or ways to address the threat, how should a public gauge the holding off that threat, addressing the threat prior to a cyber attack, to planning for an aftermath of the 80 to 90% of a cyber attack on the electric grid?
I think we need to plan for the aftermath. We need to plan for it as individuals. The federal government needs to plan for it as the collection of agencies that can best stand in our stead. Here's the problem. The internet was never designed to be defended. The internet was designed, as one intelligence officer told me, so that professors could exchange good ideas. If you can't defend something perfectly, I draw the analogy in the book to what happened with the Ebola virus. When a patient with the virus came over to Texas from West Africa, he was carrying the virus, was put in a hospital ward, a private ward, attended by 2 nurses who were covered with every possible protection gear that they could find. They had hats on, they had the plastic visors, they had not 1 but 2 uniforms on, 2 sets of gloves, 2 sets of booties. They still caught the disease. The patient was in the final stages, projectile vomiting, terrible diarrhea. The nurses caught Ebola. Why? The speculation after the fact was either when they took one of the gloves off or both of the gloves off that they inadvertently touched some of the infected fecal matter or vomit. Or alternatively, that there was a little space just on the side of their necks that was not covered, not protected. There is a reason why so much of what we talk about in cybersecurity and in talking about the internet borrows from medicine. We talk about a program having a virus. We talk about attack surfaces. We talk about the dangers of an infection of one of these programs that we have. You know, the power companies will tell you that they are superbly well protected, that everything is what they call air-gapped. In other words, no one part of the system is actually touching another part of the system. Here's what can happen, though, and it's equivalent to the nurses taking care of this patient. A worker takes a thumb drive home, inserts the thumb drive into his or her own personal computer. The thumb drive becomes infected. The next day, the worker takes the thumb drive back to work. All the firewalls in the world, all the air gapping in the world is not going to protect that program. Again, the internet was never designed to be defended.
Has the for-profit industry not learned anything from the Target credit card attacks, from the JP Morgan
Oh, sure.
cyber
Look, I mean,
incursions?
as I say, they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars. I spoke to Jamie Dimon, of J.P. Morgan. And I spoke to him 2.5 years ago. At that time, J.P. Morgan had spent $650 million on cybersecurity. By now, they've spent $1 billion on cybersecurity. About 1.5 years ago, they were hacked. 83 million of their customers' records were hacked, stolen. The story just broke, I think, about a week ago. It turns out to have been 2 Israelis and an American. Everybody thought it was the Russians. And it may indeed have been. The whole point of a cyber attack is that, someone walks into the Situation Room with the president said, "Who did it?" Well, Mr. President, it looks like the attack originated in Ukraine. But, sir, just so you understand, we've been tracking it back a little further, and before Ukraine, it looks as though it originated in Buenos Aires. And before Buenos Aires, Johannesburg, and before Johannesburg, Brussels, and before Brussels, in fact, this is as far back as we can track it at this point, looks as though the attack originated in Brooklyn. Now what do? The great danger of a cyber attack, what distinguishes it from anything we've ever known before in this country, is during the days that we were worried about a nuclear attack, the fear was that Soviet missiles would be coming in our direction. The president would have known about it in 2 minutes. He would have had another 27 or 28 minutes to decide whether to immediately launch a counterattack or whether to wait until the missiles landed before launching a counterattack. But there never would have been any question in his mind as to where the attack was coming from. If the grid goes down, the first question is going to be, who did it? And just so you have a sense of how long it can take, when Sony Pictures released that goofy movie about a North Korean dictator, and then a couple of weeks after it was announced that this movie was coming out, Sony Pictures was hacked. And all of their computers were taken down, and all of their private email messages were revealed and made public, and all of the salaries of all the top executives, right? Now, the assumption was reasonable, had to be the North Koreans. You know how long it took the FBI? Months before they could state with certainty that it was the North Koreans. We're not going to know when an attack like this comes where it originated. We're just not going to know.
We'll open up for questions. We've got a microphone here in the middle. Questions for Ted Koppel and Lights Out, a cyber attack, a nation unprepared, surviving the aftermath. You dedicate this book, Ted, to your grandchildren, and you ask in the dedication that you hope you got it wrong.
Well, sure.
Why?
Why? Because I don't want my grandkids to have to live with this kind of a threat. You know what? It's been my experience that nobody in a situation like this likes to ask the first question, so why don't we go right to the second question? Go ahead, sir. You're it.
Mr. Koppel, I teach environmental science here at the college, and I've been using a video of one of your 30-minute nightlines from about 30 years ago on climate change, and I still use it in my classes today. It was the most recent discussion of what could happen over the next 30, 40 years, and as far as I can tell, everything you said in that thing came true. And I think I'd like to just thank you for that.
That's very kind. I'm trying. No, please don't. I'm trying desperately to think, because I just got an email from him the other day, and I'm having a senior moment on the correspondent. We had one correspondent at Nightline who was absolutely fixated on this subject, and it is to him that your applause should go. I mean, he 30 years ago and to this day, he is still pressing the issue of climate change and the dangers thereof. But thank you.
Good evening, Ted Koppel. The question I wanted to pose to you is, what is your view in light of discussion over cyber attacks, is your view concerning Edward Snowden?
That's a tough one. it sort of perfectly summarizes what I was talking about a moment ago, this enormous struggle that we have to go through. On the one hand, my feeling is that Edward Snowden showed enormous courage and even patriotism in doing what he did to alert us to the dangers of any government agency, in this case the NSA, vacuuming up so much of our personal data. On the other hand, I come down in Lights Out very much on the side of having to give the NSA its head. I am convinced that we are confronting a dreadful threat, that the cyber threat to the United States can be existential. And the best equipped agency in the country is the NSA. And in the final analysis, facing what we face today, if I have to choose between the NSA being able to violate my privacy and having my privacy and a lot else violated by the Chinese or the Iranians or the Russians, I go with the NSA.
Thank you.
Mr. Koppel, I've been a fan of yours since you started Nightline, so it's an honor to have you here today.
And I must tell you that if I had legs like yours, I'd be wearing shorts too.
Thank you. The question that I have for you is, when you mentioned the fact that there are countries out there that currently do have the capability of impairing our grid, and that the one saving grace we have is that it might not be in their mutual best interest with us to do so, I wondered if, in your opinion, the reverse was also true, and even though we have weakness in our grid system, that our government might have the capability, if needed, to go ahead and inflict damage on these other countries' electrical systems, sort of preventing their doing the same thing to us, kind of along the same lines of what used to happen years ago with nuclear weapons and mutual assured destruction.
Right. And it's a terrific question, and let me put your mind at ease. Absolutely. I think the NSA is probably the most competent cyber warrior in the world. There is none better. And can we do to the Chinese what the Chinese have the capacity to do to us? Absolutely. And in the event of an all-out war between us and the Chinese, cyber war would very much be part of the overall package that we would employ against any enemy. What I'm saying to you, though, remember what I just told you about the difference between mutual assured destruction. We and the Soviets, for so many years, kept a sort of uneasy nuclear balance because we knew that they, in the wake of a US attack, a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union, could respond in kind and inflict untold damage on us, and they knew the same thing about us. The difference with a cyber attack is, if we knew that the Chinese had just launched a cyber attack on us, could we launch a counterattack on them? Absolutely. But remember now, we're not going to know immediately. And if you don't know who did it, put yourself in the situation room. Put yourself in the president's place, whoever that president may be. You know, your advisors are coming to you and saying, sir, we think it was the Chinese. And the president says, what do you mean you think? I'm about to take, 100 million people off the grid. Thousands will die. And you think the Chinese did it? What if you're wrong? Well, sir, we'll go back and look a little bit further. It's going to be a far different kind of situation than anything we have ever known before.
Thank you.
There's the additional risk, Ted, about those non-state actors that you mentioned as well in that rung of risk, the ISISes of the world and those non-state actors that don't have a infrastructure, a geographic electric grid to attack.
And here's the even greater danger. George Cotter, who was the chief scientist of the NSA, he's now retired, he's about 82 years old, but sharp as a tack. George Cotter told me that the Russians, for example, have a a whole sort of mini army of individual cyber warriors whom they have placed around the world. So that if the word ever goes out, go ahead, launch it. It won't come from Moscow. It won't come from Russia. It won't come from Ukraine. It'll come from Denmark or Queens. And then what do we do? Go ahead, sir.
Mr. Koppel, I've enjoyed watching you for many years on Nightline. I think you kept me up many nights, and I lost a lot of sleep because of many of the topics you talked about.
And now you have to resort to sex.
Young men like me get to that privilege, but I'd like to bring to your attention a capability that exists and invite your imagination into a world that is possible as it relates to cyberspace. And what I have to say relates to the signature bases that are now being detected for these various viruses which you've identified, which end up on thumb drives in the form of either Stuxnet or Flame or some other type of virus. These things invite into systems solutions which are not solutions, but they're the problem themselves. They are, in fact, the attack. They go after the attack surface, they hit the SCADA system, they knock it out based on the design that the attacker plans on using to bring these things down and down and up, in any which way they want. Imagine a world in which the provenance of all software could be identified as originating from trusted labs, whether it's Microsoft's lab in Richmond, Washington, or Bellevue, or Oracle's lab somewhere in Silicon Valley, or some other trusted facility in which this source code, which these systems depend upon, originates from, and everything else is inoculated because it's not part of a registered database of trusted solutions. This capability now exists. It's in the hands of the Department of Defense with the Chief Information Security Officer for the Department of Defense. It's been brought to the attention of the White House, to Mr. Tony Scott, who I'm sure you're familiar with, who's identified this solution as in fact having the possibility of changing the entire paradigm of how authentication is done, which is, as you know, the core for all security. So what I would do is ask you publicly, thinking about this topic from the broad top-down, bottom-up, how introducing provenance of software, the origin, where does it come from, how that might change the entire playing field. Thank you.
I mean, first of all, the only honest answer I can give you is I don't know. But I can tell you that, for example, the SCADA systems that I was talking about before, the supervisory control and data acquisition systems, most of them are manufactured by one company, Siemens. And they exist all over the world. So that, for example, the SCADA system that was in the nuclear lab at Natanz in Iran was a Siemens system. As one former cyber advisor to the president told me, if you walked into the headquarters of Pacific Gas and Electric in California, and you walked into the same branch of Shanghai Power, you would find the same Siemens SCADA system. You're probably familiar with what is called a Black Hat Conference. The Black Hat Conference is really an annual gathering of hackers, for the most part young people, but hackers who delight in disproving theories like the one that you've just suggested. One hacker a couple of years ago in Las Vegas got up and said, now Siemens is extraordinarily proud of the fact that they have an unbreakable password that makes every SCADA system all around the world accessible only to Siemens technicians. And then he said, and now here is that password. I don't know. There was a congressman years ago who used to answer letters from angry constituents by saying, dear sir or madam, you may be right.
Hey, Mr. Koppel, how are you? So this topic is incredibly interesting, if not also horrifying. In terms of allowing us to survive like these kinds of attacks? Because, I think in the not too distant past, we had, I think in 2002 or 2003, there was a power outage that took out the entire Northeast, and how people responded to it. And I know for myself, the thing that scared me the most was people just started freaking out, as the first response. But then actually, maybe about a couple hours later, they were hanging out and everything was fine. So to prevent...
And it only lasted a few days.
It was only a few days, right. Yeah. It was definitely an inconvenience for those of us who lived in New York and probably other cities, but it was tolerable. So my question is, using the metaphor of protecting against infection, right? So we as humans, we have immune systems that help us overcome infections such as the cold, such as the flu. Ebola is much more difficult to overcome. So do you feel like the solution is one where the prevention, right, is the vaccine of fixing the actual systems of communication, so the internet? So that's one. Second one is either allowing the power systems to be able to tolerate. So something happens and it causes the machine itself to fail, and it can actually recover from that. Or if it's the power grid goes down for weeks, and the real solution is to be able to have communities tolerate living without an electrical grid for 3 or 4 weeks.
Well, let me start with the last one first. In other words, there are microgrids that are being set up around the country. I believe something like 12% of the power in this country can be supplied by microgrids. For the most part, those are in rural communities. To the best of my knowledge, there is no microgrid backing things up in New York or Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Los Angeles, any of our big cities, Miami. The possibility that someone will come up with a fix, with a solution, I suppose is always there. But remember, the key to all of this is the vulnerability of the internet itself. As long as this, in the old days, before the deregulation of the power industry, an awful lot of these industries operated on their own. They had their own system. They were not interlaced with all these other systems. Now they are. And because of that, they are all vulnerable. And if I may have left out a third question. What was your?
I think can the systems themselves, can the power systems themselves tolerate going down? Attack happens.
No, they cannot. If the system is down and if it's a cascading effect, then what begins with just one part of one grid can, at least in theory, spread throughout the entire grid.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Lights Out is the book. Ted Koppel, the author. Thank you so much, Ted.